Good afternoon, and thank you for attending Getting Hired's employer webinar today. My name is Gabby Nagel, and I manage the outreach and marketing for Getting Hired. I'm also here with Adam Street, who is the Allegis Global Solutions Head of Global Marketing. If you're not familiar with Getting Hired, we are a full-service solution for employers seeking talent with disabilities nationwide. Unfortunately, we don't have our guest presenter today, Mary Scott. She had to cancel due to a family health emergency, so we won't be able to go through her campus candidate experience research in as much detail as planned. However, we will be looking at the candidate experience and primarily focusing on job seekers with disabilities points of view, particularly students with disabilities, and what employers can do to increase the number of students with disabilities that are applying to their jobs. Before we begin, I will just run through some logistics. So audio is available through your phone line. During the presentation, everyone is set to mute, so please use the chat box to the right of your screen if you have any questions during the presentation, and we'll answer them at the end. If for any reason you are unable to access the chat box, you can also email me your questions directly at gnagel@gettinghired.com. We have a live captioning service you can access through the link posted in the chat box. We'll also be recording this webinar and uploading it to the Getting Hired YouTube channel. We will email all registrants a copy of the presentation and a link to the recorded webinar. Before you exit the webinar, you'll see some feedback questions appear on your browser. We'd love to know your thoughts about the webinar, such as what information was useful, what would have improved the webinar for you, and if there are any topics you'd like to see covered in the webinar series in the future. So the topics we'll be looking at today we'll start with a broader look at the disability workforce, candidate experience using employer websites and online applications, the interview process, and then the overall impact that this candidate experience is having on job seekers with disabilities. The three key research studies we'll be drawing on are Getting Hired's own Voice of the Job Seeker survey, which is from 2015, and we'll also draw on the research from the Scott Resource Group Campus Candidate Experience as we'd planned, just not in as much detail as we had hoped for. We'll also have the Partnership on Employment and Accessible Technology, or PEAT as they're widely known, their nationwide e-recruiting and accessibility report, which they conducted in 2015. We'll be looking at that as well, and that report in particular identifies a lot of specific accessibility barriers in the hiring process for people with disabilities. So to start off, let's take a look at the wider disability employment landscape. 20% of the U.S. has some type of disability, and it's the largest diversity group in the country. The Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, defines an individual with a disability as a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, or a person who has a history or record of such an impairment, or a person who is perceived by others as having such an impairment. There are 5.9 million job seekers in this population in the workforce today. Despite the huge impact that the ADA has had in preventing discrimination of people with disabilities in employment, the employment rate for people with disabilities really continues to lag, even as the job market tightens. The Office of Disability and Employment Policy, December 2016 statistics showed that the unemployment rate for people with disabilities was 9%, which is more than double the rate of the 4.3% for individuals without disabilities. As part of Getting Hired's mission to reduce this employment gap, we conduct quarterly and annual surveys for job seekers with disabilities across the country. And we do this for a few reasons. We want to understand the job search attitudes of candidates with disabilities, and we also want to identify how the job search experience differs between candidates with and without disabilities. We also want to identify opportunities for employers to improve their disability inclusion efforts. So how do we do this? The survey is emailed to job seekers with disabilities across the country, and you can see our 2015 annual survey received 519 responses. So let's take a closer look at who these job seekers with disabilities are. So 52% of the respondents to our survey are currently unemployed, and the second highest category are working part-time or in a temporary contract role. The highest percentage of respondents classify themselves as experienced or non-management, which is 41%, and 32% have an associate's degree or technical trade or vocational qualification. Attracting and retaining talent is really a major issue for most companies nowadays, and also increasingly finding qualified candidates with the right skills. With the tightening of the job market and shortage of skilled candidates, employers are finally starting to realize the business incentive to engage as much of the talent pool as possible, even those traditionally hard-to-reach candidates. SRI International reported the number of students with a disability attending college is rising. As of 2010, 46% of young adults with disabilities were attending a college or a university within 4 years of leaving high school. This compares to only 26% in 1990. This statistic, paired with the high unemployment rate for college graduates with disabilities, points to a growing pool of untapped talent. So some of you may be familiar with Section 503 of the Rehabilitation Act, which came into effect in 2014. If you're not familiar with it, this act directs federal contractors and subcontractors to achieve a hiring goal of 7%. So this means that 7% of their workforce should be made up of individuals with disabilities. Since being implemented, it really has moved the needle in a lot of ways. In terms of the numbers of employees with disabilities in the federal workforce, and a lot of private companies have also started to take this opportunity to follow suit and are starting to focus on their own disability inclusion strategies. However, our research shows that this incentive has not really been effectively communicated to the public. 69% of the job seekers that we surveyed are not familiar with the new revisions. This is actually a big problem because for so many years it's been illegal for employers to ask candidates and employees if they have a disability. But now, in order to effectively measure the success of their disability-focused hiring, federal contractors have to invite applicants to self-identify as an individual with a disability. Understandably, there's a lot of reluctance and sensitivity around disclosing your disability when you're competing for a job. And without the knowledge that this incentive exists to disclose, people with disabilities are generally very unlikely to self-identify for fear of discrimination. This reluctance to self-identify is a major factor employers really need to consider when they're thinking about encouraging more students with disabilities to join their company. There are approximately 11% of undergraduates that have a disability, and that's 2 million students. About 60% of college graduates with a disability are not employed, and students with disabilities take twice as long to secure a job after graduation than their non-disabled counterparts. So we know the talent is out there. The big question is, how can you reach them? This is where the issue of self-disclosure really plays a big part. Statistics show that students rarely identify themselves to their educational institution, mostly only if they require an accommodation on campus. Over 70% of students with disabilities have a non-visible disability, meaning they aren't easily identifiable to any college staff who may be hoping, to connect you with them. Also, many students don't identify with the term disability once they reach a certain age. This could be due to stigma or even feeling that they're not disabled enough. There are many conditions not commonly thought of as disabilities. For example, dyslexia, anxiety, depression, ADHD, epilepsy, or even cancer. So there really isn't one major source that employers can go to in terms of building a pipeline. So with this in mind, how can employers encourage individuals with disabilities to come to them? Something worth thinking about is what the important factors are for job seekers with disabilities when they're deciding whether or not to apply for a job. So our data actually shows that the most important factors when choosing companies to apply to are opportunities for growth, the job requirements listed in the job description, and also the behavior or attitude of recruiters or hiring managers. These things have a really big impact in terms of job seekers deciding whether or not your company culture would really be the right place for them. There's also a really common misconception among employers that job seekers with disabilities search for jobs differently than those without disabilities. For example, using government agencies such as vocational rehab or ticket to work programs. These are absolutely resources that job seekers with disabilities can use, but our data shows that the strong majority of job seekers actually use general job boards like Career Builder or Monster, and also rely on companies' career websites for most of their career opportunities. They also, of course, use disability-specific job boards, but these are really the three top resources that the job seekers that we've spoken to have identified as the main ways that they try to search for work. And Pete has also confirmed this in their research. Relying on the same technology as the majority of the population means that employers have a great opportunity to use the same mediums they're already using to research the target group. But the reliance on technology can also present additional barriers for some job seekers with disabilities. Some of the information that we also saw from the SPOT resource group was that students with disabilities, students without disabilities, have the exact same issues that people with disabilities are running into when tied to technology as well. So one of the number of things that they were all asking about when applying to positions was ease of use. Ease of use for a person with a disability or without allows a person to apply quickly, not to duplicate the amount of content that they have to write in. So if a person has to upload a resume and then turn around and resubmit a form filling out the exact same information, it tends to turn off both of those types of candidates from applying to that business. Some of the ways to get around that would be to look at something a little bit more seamless, a way for them to just be able to simply upload their resume, to allow all of that information to be populated, or the resume being simply sent to the HR manager for them to be able to take a look at and see if the candidate is qualified or not. So to engage students and other individuals with disabilities, we really need to look at the main job search tools that they're using to connect with employers. The most commonly used technology when applying for jobs is computers or laptops. 54% of our job seekers that we surveyed said that that is the main source of technology that they use when applying for jobs. The most commonly used technology when applying for jobs is computers or laptops. 54% of our job seekers that we surveyed said that that is the main source of technology that they use when applying for jobs. This was also the case in the Scott Resource Group student candidate experience research. The students surveyed also said, well, 96 to 100% of them said that they reported using laptops over other mobile technology. However, the number of job seekers with disabilities also using mobile devices is actually much higher at 25%. And Pete also found this in their research. 58% have searched for a job using a mobile device. So ensuring that your site is mobile compatible will really help that quarter of job seekers with disabilities in their ability to apply for your jobs as well.
Some of the things that we have seen through the Scott Resource Group is the reason that those candidates or students are actually applying via laptop is because they stated that they were trying to take that job application very seriously. And a number of them didn't have their application on a mobile device. Now, this is something to take into consideration when you're also talking about people with disabilities, because a number of them use those mobile devices because of the accessible technology built into them. So where a student may be looking at using 96% of the time a laptop to apply for a position, a person with a disability or a student with a disability may be looking for some of those additional accessibility functions that they can only be found within either screen readers on a laptop or on some of their mobile devices. So having a very simple way for them to apply really would increase the amount of people that are applying for those jobs from both groups.
Pete's report identified the big impact that technology accessibility is really having on job seekers with disabilities, their experience in applying for jobs. So 46% of those that Pete surveyed, rated their last experience applying for a job online as difficult to impossible. Of those who tried to get technical assistance from employers, only 42% were able to complete the application, 58% were not. This barrier was also reported in the use of pre-employment assessments and testing. 67% had been asked to complete a pre-employment assessment or some kind of testing for the job opportunity, and of those, 22% were unable to complete the testing, 19% required assistance. So some of the things that Pete's identified are things like confusing instructions on a website, an account sign-up that's difficult to navigate, document upload tools that time out without warning. These are all issues that affect all applicants, not just people with disabilities. Fixing accessibility issues and ensuring that you're creating a user-friendly process really helps all applicants. So think of things like closed captioning and voice recognition. You know, some of the technologies that were initially created for people with disabilities are now used by everyone. So some specific examples of accessibility issues that Pete identified include the screen contrast and typeface size, which may make using a website difficult for individuals with low vision. Video captioning, not having video captioning or even the text transcript available can also be a barrier for people with hearing loss. There's also complex navigation can be difficult, timeout restrictions, no alt text for images as well, inaccessible form fields, so people that may have difficulty using a mouse, for example, should be able to navigate your page and should be able to input information into your form field without needing to rely on a mouse. So these sorts of things can make a really, really big difference in terms of individuals' ease of being able to apply and not just sort of giving up before they can even put themselves forward. Our job seekers' experience of being successfully provided appropriate accommodations was similar to what Pete found. 205 out of our 519 respondents said that they have requested an accommodation from an employer at some point. Of those 205 individuals, 88 were successfully provided with their needed accommodation, while 75 were not provided the accommodation by the employer. So accessibility is definitely an issue. It's also an issue when it comes to using social media. So Pete's study found that 50% of respondents have used social media to search for jobs, 40% experience accessibility or usability issues with social media, and 22% use social media sites such as LinkedIn to apply for a job. So it's not saying that you should no longer use these formats to reach out to job seekers and to publish your job openings. It's just something to be aware of, not to completely rely on it, and to also find out ways around some of the accessibility difficulties that could arise.
Some of the things we've seen over the last couple of years grow between organizations are those online assessment tools. It's the secondary step after a person goes in and applies for a position. There may be additional questions to be able to filter down the number of candidates. Well, some of those things have negative impacts not only on people with disabilities, but students without disabilities as well. Some of the comments that came out of Ohio State were around the fact that they have taken online assessment tests and unfortunately had to retake them when they were on site for an interview. In the side for a person with a disability, sometimes those are simply built in as a screen refresh, and people with visual disabilities are not actually able to see the screen change. Thus, they're never able to actually complete the full application, automatically having them thrown out of the system. So looking at some of those online tests, understanding that they're very valuable for an organization, they're a great way for us to be able to identify the strongest candidates, at the same time have negative impacts on both the students that are trying to be attracted as well as people with disabilities looking for those same jobs.
So this is just a couple of examples of accommodation statements that some of Getting Hired's employers have on their career sites. A fast expanding segment of the disability population is actually experienced professionals who acquire disabilities as they reach the height of their careers after age 40. Today's multi-generational workforce of baby boomers, Gen X, and millennials is really bringing diverse perspectives and abilities to the workforce like never before. But this, of course, also means it's more important than ever that employers ensure they're able to not just accommodate, but support and advance individuals of all ages, experience levels, and abilities in performing their very best. People are living longer than ever before, and retirement is becoming increasingly deferred for many reasons. So it stands to reason that the numbers of individuals living with disabilities will only continue to grow. And without accessibility awareness, catching up to the rapidly changing technology of the 21st century, larger sections of the workforce will continue to be excluded from the employment opportunities. So you can see just simple things like having, a few sentences about how anyone experiencing difficulty using your website or trying to get information about a job or actually filling in the online job application. Having an accommodation statement like these is really, really important. You should basically put it anywhere, as many places as possible to make it visible. Put it where the job applications are, put it in the diversity and inclusion pages. You should have a really clear set out process for people that are experiencing any kind of accessibility problems. Also give a couple of different contact methods as well. For example, if you just have a phone number, that might not be the best communication option for some people, and same with email. So it's good to include a couple of different ways that they can get in contact with you, and you can look at providing that information in an alternative format. So looking closer at the interview process, you can see the top 3 responses from Getting Hired's research asking what the most frustrating aspect during a job search is. The top response of which frustrations we see with all job seekers across the board, with and without disabilities, is the little to no response from recruiters after they've applied. So this is really a very common complaint and frustration. Like I said, job seekers with and without disabilities mention this constantly in candidate feedback research. There's also additional frustrations, though, for job seekers with disabilities. They also said recruiters and managers who are not sensitive to their disability is one of their top frustrations as well. The accuracy of job descriptions is also an issue. So that's the third top frustration, ensuring that job descriptions are accurate, they're very clear, it's clear what, is a requirement and what isn't, so that they can also assess whether, their disability will have any kind of impact on the most important job duties and what accommodations they can be thinking about to suggest so that they can actually, perform all of the necessary tasks. 12% also said that employers being unable to meet their request for a reasonable accommodation was a frustration, and then 10% said career websites that are not accessible. So you can see they've got the 2 frustrations that are really common to most job seekers, but then they also have these additional frustrations, making the job application process that little bit more difficult.
This is, as we mentioned, this is seen across everybody, with and without disabilities. Some of the things that we saw from the Scott Resource Group, they had anecdotal information about, they said I'd hear in 2 weeks, and it's been 2 months. I thought that, it went complete radio silence, and I heard nothing for 7 months until they called me back. Little things like the follow-up, the follow-through, even an email to let them know that the process is still ongoing, that the process is closed, they unfortunately didn't get it. This is not something that, each and every company, doesn't do, but a majority of companies still fall into this trap of not responding to individuals, whether they have a disability or not. Some of the other areas that they've heard about is that students, just like any of the rest of us, are really looking for a personalized experience. We want the companies to actually understand that we are a valued person that they're looking to hire. So whether you're a person with a disability interviewing or whether you're a student coming fresh out of college, they want to know that they are wanted in that business and they are going to be invested in. There have been horror stories, and we've seen them before, where they're stuck in an all-day group interview, or they've had somebody who's never interviewed anybody before get pulled in to interview a person because somebody else had a meeting to go to, or even things that we've seen within our own career fairs where we work with our own companies to be better at is when somebody goes to a career fair and they stand in line for 10 minutes and then they finally get a chance to speak to a recruiter, the recruiter gives them a quick spiel and then turns around and says for them to apply online. We've seen that not only in real career fairs, but actually in virtual career fairs, and even taking a little bit of extra time to gather the right type of information about that person creates a better response from them and a better understanding about what that business and what that culture is really like, and can sometimes really change the difference between whether they want to work there or they don't want to work there. So really taking that time to understand those candidates, what they're really looking for, and kind of changing the way that we do things will probably positively impact you in the future when both hiring students and people with disabilities.
It really is a widespread issue, the lack of understanding and the lack of training when it comes to how to manage candidates with disabilities in terms of proper communication, having a really transparent accommodation process, being able to provide the support that they need in a very clear and simple way. And that's acknowledged through research like this. Among HR professionals, 68% admit that their current recruiting processes are not capable of finding qualified people with disabilities. 48% admit to having little to no knowledge of how to implement a reasonable accommodation, and 63% are not confident in their organization's handling of employee disabilities and accommodations. So it's a new area that a lot of companies are really only just recently starting to acknowledge that they need to ensure that they have the proper processes in place, and that the training and the knowledge is there, and also looking at different ways to ensure that staff at every level have, at least a basic understanding of how to work well with somebody that has a disability, and sort of the right ways to communicate, and good ways to be able to support them if needed. So now we're going to kind of wrap it up and look at the impact all of this is having on the actual candidates themselves, and their desire to work with employers that they've been experiencing these kinds of problems with. So when choosing whether or not to disclose the disability to an employer, Getting Hired's results show that the behavior or attitude of the recruiter or hiring manager is the most important factor. So, going back to what Adam was talking about with the Scott Resource Group's research, the behavior and the attitude of recruiters and hiring managers is a big factor to all applicants, students as well. Recruiters need to be really aware that, they're representing the company, they're representing the company culture, and students and, people with disabilities, they will assume that their attitude and behavior is representative of the kind of culture there. So having that basic etiquette and that kind of sensitivity around the issue of disclosing a disability and how to communicate and make candidates with disabilities feel comfortable enough to be able to discuss their disability if needed is really a big, big factor in how your company will be viewed as a disability-friendly employer.
Also, when we're looking at jobs and the types of positions that a company is hiring for, simple things that we've seen through the Scott Resource Group, which is actually something similar that we see with job seekers with disabilities, is having simple filtering items. Some of the things we may see from people with disabilities, they're looking for more virtual jobs, looking for jobs that can be done out of the office, they're looking for part-time positions, they're looking for a broad range that they can potentially work for. Students with disabilities coming out of this Scott Resource Group data, they're looking for similar things as well. They're looking for the difference between what's an internship job versus what's a job for a brand new college grad. Having simple filters to allow them to find certain things would probably increase the amount of people that are looking for specific requirements for those jobs so that they know that they meet them when they go to apply the first time around.
So that link to that is, the clarity of job requirements, the clarity of the ease in which applicants can find the jobs and opportunities that they're looking for. Another big factor as to whether candidates disclose or not is the actual job description itself and the requirements listed in that job description. So, going back to what we were saying about there being, a top frustration, the accuracy of the job description, that actually also impacts their decision whether or not to disclose their disability. So if they're reading a job description and they think the way it's worded, it sounds like, there may be some reluctance from the employer to actually hire them if their disability could be, could have an impact on that, they're not going to disclose. They're not going to, voluntarily give up information that could be used against them when they're competing for a job. So as well as the recruiter's attitude and behavior, it's also really important to think about the job requirements and to make them as disability-friendly as possible. So, be very clear that you are a disability-friendly employer, you are open to applicants with disabilities, and that isn't going to be something that's held against them when looking at their suitability to complete the job task. The third factor of what candidates decide, when candidates are deciding if they should disclose to an employer or not, is the company's reputation as a disability-friendly employer. So 58% said that that is a really important factor when they're deciding whether or not to disclose having a disability. So again, making sure that your company is coming across as disability-friendly as possible. You have the support in place. You have disability-focused messaging on your site. Your job description is clearly disability-friendly as well. All of these things are going to impact how open they are about having a disability, and that in turn is going to help you to be able to manage or to measure how many people with disabilities you're actually hiring, because you just won't be able to know how successful these efforts are being if you aren't creating the right kind of atmosphere and the right kind of environment for people to feel comfortable enough to disclose having a disability. Two other factors you can see there, company values and culture and opportunities for growth. So both of those things are also important in assessing whether or not they're going to talk about having a disability. And those factors are also, they take a lot of priority for the students that the Scott Resource Group also questioned in terms of, their priorities of deciding whether or not to apply to certain companies. So here are some simple things that you can do right now. Individuals with disabilities are individuals first. So many individual applicants will be drawn to your company for its reputation, its career opportunities, and their own interests and skills. But embracing disability inclusion as part of your company culture and sharing those proactive efforts that you're making can really have a big impact on the number of candidates with disabilities being attracted to your company and, again, being able to actually disclose having a disability. So just a couple of easy things you can implement, pretty much straight away to encourage more job seekers with disabilities to apply to your job. You want to, as we looked at before, have an accommodation statement on your careers site, and also go through that process of requesting an accommodation yourself. See how easy it is. What happens when you email the address? What happens when you call the person? How confident are they in actually managing that request? Make sure that, that they're not seen as, thinking about support for their employees as, a kind of end of the list, not a priority for them. You want to make sure that that accommodation statement is there and that process is really clear and simple to go through. As we mentioned before, clear and accurate job descriptions, also very important, and familiarizing yourself with basic disability etiquette. So ensuring that your recruiters are confident in being able to communicate well with people with disabilities, and helping them to feel comfortable in interviews, and also helping them to feel that if they need an accommodation for whether it be for the job application, for the interview itself, or performing the tasks in the job description, you want to make sure that they're able to communicate that and manage that as effectively as possible. In terms of looking at students with disabilities, something we mentioned before, integrating disability-focused messaging into all of your recruitment outreach. So, this is good across the board, but also particularly in colleges, when you're sending out any kind of career opportunities to career centers and you're having them shared out to students, make sure you also have some kind of disability-focused messaging in there as well. It could be something really simple, such as, like below, including a disability-friendly employer wording or message or some kind of symbol for it. It could also be, if you're on campus and you're attending things like career fairs or recruiting events and workshops, having something like a colored ribbon or a sticker or a badge, something just to stand out, just to say, we are aware of the support needed when someone has a disability, and that's not going to be held against you. We want to hire more people, and you can feel comfortable enough to approach us and know that, we are trying our best to create that kind of culture and environment to make all of our employees feel comfortable and perform at their very best.
Some of the bigger ticket items, things that we just kind of mentioned throughout this, website usability, making that as simple as possible for a person to be able to find those jobs and apply to that position. Taking out some of the things that maybe you don't really need. You may not need them to update an entire form if you already got their resume. Also adding in some of those additional filters, whether they're for internships or, new college university graduates or virtual careers or part-time jobs. Sometimes those things are little things that can make a big difference in the number of people that are applying and getting them into the right positions rather than having to guess afterwards.
So start thinking about the colleges and the universities that you're already working with. Start thinking about some of the disability-focused messaging that you could be using in the resources you're already sending out, and any tweaks that you can make. And you could also ask directly any college career centers that you are
approaching in the future, bring up the fact that you are trying to reach out to more students with disabilities. Ask them, what ideas they have, if they have anything in place, there is the Disability Services Office that every college and university also has. This office is to their sole role is to support students with disabilities and to provide any accommodations that the students might need on campus in terms of accessing their information in class and getting their work done. So it could also be worthwhile reaching out to that service sometimes. Reaching out to both the Career Center and the Disability Services can really give you that extra communication. Don't assume that both of those will be in communication with each other and that they'll be aware of the disability inclusive efforts you're trying to make with one. It's worth communicating that message with both. And while the student information is confidential that they have, you can talk with them about, sharing your information and current and future positions that are coming out that they could maybe send out to the students that they know have a disability and they've been supporting themselves. So as part of, creating the right branding and showing that you are a disability-friendly employer, applicants really also want to see the efforts you're making. They want to see the community commitment that you're showing and how serious you are about reaching out to the disability community. So forging relationships with community-based organizations is a really, really great way as well to increase your outreach. Some of these local and national organizations can be really, really valuable resources. They can help you to engage with job seekers on a local level through their networks, and they can also be great resources in providing disability education and training for your company. It could be resources that they provide to you. Some of them provide the training themselves, and often, most of their resources are free. So it's just really about accessing them and showing them that the interest is there and you would like to work with them. So some of those organizations could be, we have a few examples here that are some of Getting Hired's community partners, which includes JAN, which is the Job Accommodation Network. They are really fantastic for any information around accommodations. They are completely objective and they provide free information for employers and job seekers or for any individuals with a disability. Ask Earn is also a great resource, similar to them, but they have really more of an employer perspective focus. There's also organizations that are involved with internships and mentorships, programs that are working with young people with disabilities. Broad Futures is a good example. So they are DC-based, but they work with students with disabilities and are always looking for employers to set up inclusive internships with. USBLN, again, is the U.S. Business Leadership Network. They are a national organization, but they have local chapters all over. So it's definitely worth looking at their site, at some of the resources that they have. They also have a career link mentoring program that you can look at getting involved in as well. And then there's, the vocational rehabilitation centers, other nonprofits like Easter Seals, and the National Center for Independent Living. There are hundreds of those across the country that you could get in touch with. Also look to other employers. Find out which employers are the ones that are really being recognized for their disability efforts. You can get a good number of employers to research on the DEI index, the Disability Equality Index, which is USBLN and AAPD run. So that's annual, and they publish the results of all of the great employers that are really making the effort to be disability inclusive. And then there's also like Diversity Top 50 is another resource you can look into that lists all the most diverse employers out there, and they actually break that down into different diversity groups. The OFCCP and the EEOC are really starting to hold companies accountable for excluding people with disabilities. You may notice that there has clearly been an increase in the number of disability discrimination suits out there. There's a lot more in the headlines about different companies that are being held accountable, and you know, it isn't necessarily that it's getting worse. It's just that, you know, companies are being more held accountable, really, and these kinds of cases are being increasingly brought to light. So, you know, there's a lot of incentive to really make sure that you're doing absolutely everything you can to encourage as many people with disabilities as possible to approach your company. Having said that, things are moving in the right direction. In just the last couple of years, you may have noticed accessibility has been a really hot topic. It's made a lot of headlines, as also has universal design. Universal design is enabling as many people as possible to be able to use a product or service. So rather than making, you know, tweaks at the end of a product, you're really thinking about a completely inclusive and you know, user-friendly experience from the get-go, from the initial design. And you know, like we said with the applications earlier, that's useful for everyone, not just people with disabilities. And it usually will improve the product or service as well. So a lot of this universal design and a lot of discussions around accessibility and increasing awareness around the power of having a diverse workforce and the different perspectives that it brings, it's brought a lot of innovation and a lot of new technical capabilities as well. So, you know, being able to use all this technology, although there, you know, are accessibility issues, there's also a lot of new technology that's allowing people with disabilities to perform tasks that, you know, may not have been something that they could manage in the past. You can see here there's some results about the effect on employee performance of having people with disabilities being a part of your workforce. So it's been shown to improve things like staff morale. It can increase employee retention, lower absenteeism. So, you know, a common misconception might be someone with a disability would take more time off or, you know, require an expensive accommodation to be able to perform some of their tasks, when actually, you know, through countless research, this has been disproven. Employees with disabilities, through a lot of this research, have shown to have very, very low rates of absenteeism, and most accommodations are actually free. If there's a cost at all, it's usually a one-off, and the amount of $500, I think, is often quoted, but most of the time it's very simple adjustments that you can make that don't even necessarily have a cost associated.
And most of the time when you're talking about a person with a disability, an accommodation may be a different type of laptop. If you look at a number of organizations, I mean, even in ours, we have everything from PCs to Macs. So simply ordering a new laptop would be maybe a little bit more than your $500, but it's something that you're going to probably do for most employees anyway. So most of the time they're not asking for things like rebuilding the front entrance or having to, you know, put in special parking or things like that. Usually it's simple things that can be picked up just from regular purchase orders from Staples and things like that. So this is just a sample of
some of the headlines we were talking about. Accessibility awareness and, you know, awareness of the barriers that is causing is really starting to spread. Things are moving in the right direction. You can see here we mentioned, you know, there are some accessibility issues occasionally with using social media, and Facebook has publicly recognized that and are using different technology to try and get around that and to try and enable their platform to be as accessible as possible. Same goes for Twitter. They've made some headlines around that as well. Google has a really, really big disability focus. You know, they're definitely leaders in the technology innovation area, and bringing this to people with disabilities is really one of their main objectives. They had a big impact challenge there where it was a global challenge, and they had people submit ideas and designs for different technology to help people with disabilities. You can see Starbucks. They've always been great for diversity, and they've been coming out with a few different programs targeted at just, you know, pushing their hiring numbers of people with disabilities. Microsoft as well, they've had a autism-focused hiring process recently, which has apparently been tremendously successful, and they're thinking of, I think, actually expanding that to different areas. And those are, at the bottom there, you can see the diversity in top 50s, what I mentioned earlier. You can find a lot of companies that are leading in the effort for disability inclusion. And then the Disability Equality Index from USBL and AAPD. You know, you can Google a lot of this, and you'll come out with a lot of ideas and information and good examples of what other employers are implementing. So these are just a couple of additional resources you might find useful. Like I said, we'll be emailing this presentation and the recording to everyone next week. So these will be included as well. So we'll include the PEAT report that we've been referring to. You can actually see it there on their website as well. NOD did a report called Bridging the Employment Gap for Students with Disabilities. So they have a lot of the suggestions we mentioned, and a lot of other suggestions that you could be implementing directly with college career centers. And there's a Getting Hired white paper in there as well for best practices for attracting talent with disabilities, which, you know, goes into more specific information about some of the things we've been talking about today. So that is it. We haven't received any questions during the presentation. If anyone has any questions now, feel free to type them into the chat box. I'll give you a couple of seconds to type in anything there. There's also, you can go on the gettinghired.com site directly as well and contact us through that if there's any additional information you'd really like. I'll include my email as well in the email that I send out. So, you know, feel free to reach out to us anytime if there's any more information you'd like, or, you know, any resources you'd like more information on. Yep, somebody's asking if we will be sending the presentation out, and we definitely will. We'll be sending this to everyone next week, and we'll also be including the campus candidate experience, the Scott Resource Group research that we mentioned. So that's the original research that we unfortunately weren't able to look at in much depth today. But we'll include that as well in the email, so you can look at that in your own time and reach out to Mary Scott directly as well if you'd like more information about that. So thank you so much for joining us. And as I said, we'll be in touch soon, probably next week, and enjoy the rest of your week.